Grace and peace. I'm Brian Muster, the Baptist campus minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. And we are continuing our series through the book of Genesis chapters 1 through 11, talking about the meaning of creation. Where does humanity belong? And this is the first lesson in the series, talking and just doing a general introduction on the book of Genesis. And as this is the first lesson in the series, this is the second video of that first lesson. And we're going to be talking about the conversation that Genesis enters into. So quite often what we're talking about is humanity throughout the history of time has always asked the question, where did we come from? Where did these things begin? How did this happen? What was the beginning of all this? And there is a general human conversation about that. And Genesis enters into that conversation. And quite often we're still having that conversation today. So just looking at this, in recent times, our study of Genesis often focuses on how the details in Genesis, especially the first 3 chapters, relate to the modern worldview. And when I'm talking about the modern worldview, especially in this, how we use ideas in physics of the Big Bang Theory and ideas in biology of evolutionary theory to explain not just science stuff, but to create this narrative about where did this all come from. And as we create this narrative, we also always, in narrative form, provide meaning. So quite often the modern worldview derives the meaning of the present world from the story of the Big Bang / evolutionary theory. So that's what I'm talking about when I say modern worldview. So Genesis, quite often when we study Genesis, we study it in relationship to the modern worldview, actually in contrast quite often to the modern worldview. But that forces us to ask questions of the Genesis text that were in no way relevant to the lives of the original author and or audience. Questions about the age of the earth and the length of days in Genesis 1. The length of the days in Genesis 1 would not have been asked when the text was written. They would not have been of interest to the readers. I imagine if you asked an ancient reader of Genesis if the days of Genesis in Genesis 1 were the same length of our current 24-hour Earth days or millions of thousands of years grouped into ages, the answer to you would be, huh? See, I think, and this is just something I sort of believe, is that the text itself, asking that question, asking questions like that, asking questions that our modern worldview wants to ask of Genesis, doesn't necessarily even make sense in Genesis, and actually leads us to do somewhat of an eisegesis instead of an exegesis. We try to find answers to our modern questions in Genesis instead of trying to just see what Genesis says for itself. So this debate we have between young Earth creationists and evolutionists about the age of the Earth and how many days were recorded in Genesis 1, whether they were 24-hour Earth days or millions of years, or even whether or not that's possible. That's asking questions of the text that wouldn't even cross the mind of the original author or the original audience. And it's asking the text to answer questions that we wanted to answer instead of looking at the text and trying to read what it says to begin with. Now, that's not to say that Genesis 1 through, well, it is to say that Genesis 1 through 11 was not written in conversation with our modern worldview. Our modern worldview comes thousands of years after Genesis. However, a case can be made that our modern worldview was written in an antagonistic conversation with Genesis 1 through 11, and because of that, a potential dialogue exists and could be meaningful. So this idea that Genesis doesn't care about what we think now, because Genesis didn't even imagine some of what we think now. But when we were writing this modern worldview, we cared what Genesis said, and quite often we developed this modern worldview in purposeful contrast to Genesis. So in that way, our modern worldview is in conversation with Genesis. However, Genesis is not necessarily in conversation with the modern worldview. Genesis didn't even know the modern worldview would exist at that time. So quite often the conversation goes one direction instead of the next, and we have to hear what Genesis says for Genesis itself, especially chapters 1 through 11, instead of trying to force it to answer questions that modern worldview wants it to ask, but it was no way intended to answer whatsoever. Looking at this a little bit different, Genesis is, if I were to give it a genre, it would be the genre of creation myth. Now, we get kind of weird with that word myth because we think myths are untrue and things like that, but that's not what I mean with this term. I would define a creation myth as a narrative of how the world came into being that tries to bring meaning and purpose into the present by explaining the ultimate past or explaining the origins. And if this is true, then both Genesis 1 through 11 and the modern worldview encapsulated with the Big Bang evolutionary narrative would both be considered creation myths. And as such, they are in competition with each other, trying to provide distinct narrative explanations to the same present. There's this interesting thing that creation myths are always kind of designed by the smartest people in the world at that time, or the smartest people in that culture, the smartest people in that society, using the information that they think is true at that moment to explain the past. And by explaining the past, explaining the origins, explaining the ultimate past, explaining where things came from, they're not just explaining the past, they're trying to put the present into context and give meaning to our everyday lives. By thinking about where we came from, they're trying to tell a story about where we came from so that where we are now makes more sense. And when you do that, that's a creation. So even the science, stuff like the science that we have now, isn't a creation myth. But when we start putting it in a narrative, like TV shows like The Cosmos, or these narrative forms that talk about how the Big Bang Theory gives meaning and purpose to here now, or even doesn't give meaning and purpose to here now, but putting it in that narrative form, that story form that tries to provide meaning and purpose for our lives now, then it becomes a creation myth. The story part, the narrative part that brings meaning and purpose, or tries to bring meaning and purpose. That's what I mean. That's what I highlight when I'm talking about both Genesis 1 through 11 and the modern worldview as the modern narrative that we use from the Big Bang and evolutionary theory to kind of just create a story that has meaning, that adds meaning, purpose to everyday life. And as such, as that means that these two independent stories, Genesis and modern worldview, are trying to explain the same present from different points of view, and therefore are in somewhat antagonistic to one another. The stories are definitely in contrast to each other. However, Genesis 1 through 11 wasn't written in direct conversation with the modern worldview, because the modern worldview didn't exist. It was written in conversation with the ancient Near Eastern worldview. In this study, we'll highlight how Genesis interacts with the ancient Near Eastern creation myths, especially when it is in strong contrast to the ancient world. For instance, the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian creation myth that was around, probably predates the writing of Genesis, talks of the creation of the world out of already existing matter, the fighting between multiple gods, and the creation of humanity as servants or even slaves of the gods. So the Enuma Elish describes a world it describes the origins of the world that is very different than what Genesis describes. It describes pre-existing matter. It describes warring gods. It describes human slaves to those gods. Whereas Genesis describes creating out of nothing, describes one God in complete control, and describes humans that were more empowered by God instead of slaves or servants by God. As we see, it looks like Genesis was written to repudiate those ancient Near Eastern creation myths. And the commentator K.A. Matthews points out this way. Instead of borrowing or historicizing of ancient myth, it is fair to say that Genesis comes closer to a repudiation of pagan ideas about origins, mankind, civilization, and the flood. Rather than a true polemic, however, in general, the Genesis accounts are inferentially undermining the philosophical basis for pagan myth. So this idea, like, it comes in direct contrast, and it looks like Genesis is written to say, no, that story, that narrative that those people believe about the beginning of the world is wrong. And this is the right story. And by getting this right story, we give humanity a meaning and a purpose that it never had, could never have from that previous story. So that's what we're doing. And a lot of this series will look at what Genesis says in conversation with other ancient myths means that Genesis is making a point of meaning and purpose. And we won't so much argue with the modern worldview, except when it's necessary. But we won't necessarily argue with the modern worldview as much as we'll show what Genesis is trying to say in and of itself. So, questions for you to think about. How does using the word myth to talk about Genesis 1 through 11 or the modern worldview, the Big Bang evolutionary theory, make you feel? Drop down in the comments. I would love to hear what you have to say about that. Do you have questions about the connection between Genesis 1 through 11 and our current explanations for the universe? What do you know, if anything, about other ancient Near East creation myths or creation myths in general? I would love to hear some of those comments down in the comment section. If you have any interest, I would love to start a conversation with that. I enjoyed having this conversation with you, and if you want to join the conversation, there are 3 ways: in person, Sunday nights at 5 p.m. in the JEMIC, live Monday nights 7 p.m. via Zoom, and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and or WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, WordPress, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and follow me there, engage me in conversation there, like, subscribe, and follow. Again, enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully it continues real soon.